What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time where I'm at right now is 7:46 p.m. and today is December 1st, 2025. Clean shaven, we survived, no nut and no shave November. We looking fresh, we looking sexy, we looking handsome, we looking pretty. And we are back for our 17th book in our Book to React series, where we read an entire text cover to cover, learning with the people, sharing knowledge with the people, educating the people. This is a history of psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. I say mysterious because no picture of him can be found anywhere. If you can find it, send it over my way. I want to put him in the thumbnail. Anyway, we're reading this text because I took a class on the history of psychology at the university I'm studying at out here in Budapest as I get my sociology degree. And we are currently in chapter 2, where we're reading on the roots of psychology in ancient Greece. This is, of course, written from a Western perspective, but still, we're taking it in, analyzing the text, critiquing the text, and also learning as we go. The last live stream was very good. Hopefully, you enjoyed it as well. And without further ado, we're going to be continuing the section on ancient Greece. We will be on live for about an hour, so we will be reading until, let's say, 8:50 p.m. my time. And any comments in the chat, I will be reacting to, so if you got anything you want to say it with your chest. Let's go. The first proto-psychologist, Alcmaeon and Empedocles. When psychology was founded as a science in the 19th century, it took a path through physiology. The new psychology was conceived as the scientific offspring of a fruitful marriage between philosophy of mind and the science of physiology. This marriage, or alliance as Wilhelm Wundt called it, was reflected in the careers of psychology's main founders, Wundt, William James, and Sigmund Freud, all of whom received MD degrees before becoming psychologists. However, long before psychology established itself as a science on the path through physiology, there were physicians, philosophers, proto-psychologists who approached explaining mind and behavior using the methods and findings of physiology. Go into the comments. Kamal gave a pound sign to Kamal out there. Let's continue. The first seems to have been Alcmaeon of Croton, flourished in 500 BCE. He was interested in philosophy and directed his attention to understanding perception. He dissected the eye and traced the optic nerve to the brain. Unlike later thinkers, such as Empedocles and Aristotle, Alcmaeon correctly believed that sensation and thought occur in the brain. Alcmaeon also proposed a view of perception that was developed into the first theory in psychology by another physician-philosopher who opposed Parmenides' rejection of the validity of experience. The idea of this proto-psychologist, Empedocles of Acras, flourished in 450 BCE, may be regarded as the forerunner of empiricism, the orientation to philosophy that finds truth in appearances and rejects reason as tending to fantasy. Following Alcmaeon, Empedocles believed that the senses are ducts of understanding through which information about the world travels to the brain, and upon that basis developed a theory of perception that would justify our common sense reliance on our senses. Empedocles proposed that objects emit effluences, sense modality specific copies of themselves that enter the body through the ducts of the senses. Unlike Alcmaeon, Empedocles returned to the usual Greek location of the mind in the heart or chest, saying that the effluences get in the bloodstream where they meet and mix in the heart. The agitation of the effluences in the beating of the heart, Empedocles argued, was thinking. Although it sounds absurd, his theory was an important step for naturalism in psychology because it proposed a purely physical basis for mental activity, which was usually attributed to a soul. I guess to them intuitively, that would have made sense, because your senses tell you when things are around you are changing. You see danger, your heart starts beating faster. You feel love, your heart starts beating a certain way, maybe skips a beat. You know what I mean? You're hungry. I know your heart might slow down too. So maybe intuitively to Empedocles, how the heart beats could, symbolize thinking or signal that thinking is done in the chest, I guess. A key feature of the various proto-psychologists we will meet along the way to the founding of scientific psychology is that they worked in an intersection between philosophy and psychology. That is, they took up philosophical questions such as, do we know the world truly? Or what is the best way for people to live? And addressed them from a psychological perspective. Instead of speculating about human knowledge, they inquired into how sensation, perception, and thought actually work, using their findings to reflect back on philosophical issues about the possibilities and means of justifying knowledge. Instead of debating ethical positions, they inquired into human nature, trying to discover what motives people have and how they might be managed to attain the good life. Scientific psychologists have kept up this tradition, using scientific inquiries into human nature to address issues in epistemology, decision-making, and the relations between human beings and human society. The last physicist, atomism. The last classical philosophers to be concerned primarily with the nature of physical reality were Leucippus of Miletus, flourished in 430 BCE, and his better-known student Democritus of Abdera, flourished in 420 BCE. After them, philosophers turned to questions about human knowledge, morality, and happiness. These atomists proposed an idea that has proven immensely fruitful in physics, that all objects are composed of infinitesimally small atoms. The atomists pushed their hypothesis to its limit, supporting two ideas that have seemed dangerous to some philosophers and ordinary people: materialism and determinism. A recurring motto of Democritus was that only atoms and the void exist in reality. There is no God and no soul, only material atoms and empty space. If only atoms exist, then free will must be an illusion. Leucippus said, nothing happens at random. Everything happens out of reason and by necessity, providing a naturalistic explanation of Tyche. Soul and free will are illusions that should be abandoned and replaced by naturalistic science. Democritus became known as the laughing philosopher for the moral conclusions he drew from his naturalism. The Hellenistic dramatist Lucian, born in 120 and died in 200 CE, imagining Democritus and other philosophers put on sale by the gods, has a prospective buyer exclaim, "You're laughing at us all? You think our life's nothing?" Democritus replies, "That's right. It's just atoms moving in the infinite." Atomism deepened the divide between appearance and reality. Democritus wrote, "We know nothing accurately in reality, but only as it changes according to the bodily condition and the constitution of those things that impinge upon the body," concluding that only reason can penetrate to the reality of the atoms. Democritus adopted a version of Empedocles' theory of cognition. Democritus said that every object gives off special kinds of atoms called eidola, which are copies of the object. When these reach our senses, we perceive the object indirectly through its copy. Thus, our thought processes are restricted to putting together or taking apart the eidola images in our brains. Democritus also maintained an ethical doctrine that came to trouble later ethical philosophers and psychologists. A consistent materialism, denying as it does God and the soul, typically offers a sensuous guide to the conduct of life, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This doctrine is called hedonism, and it will be fully developed as a psychology of motivation and political philosophy by the utilitarians of the 19th century. Democritus said, "The best thing for man is to pass his life so as to have as much joy and as little trouble as may be." Hedonism reduces moral values to our natural bodily experiences of pleasure and pain. To many, however, it is offensive, for if an individual's pleasure is the sole criterion of the good, what right has anyone to condemn the happy and successful criminal or tyrant? Such moral concerns were at the heart of Socrates and Plato's thinking, and Plato once suggested burning Democritus's books on ethics, but not his books on science. Sorry if I'm stumbling a bit. Whenever Acty walks into the room, I just get distracted. That girl too fine. She too fine. Continuing here. The classical period, 500 to 323 BCE. The social context, empire and war. As the Greek city-states established themselves and colonized the Mediterranean, they came into conflict with the Persian Empire. In a series of campaigns, the Persians tried to capture Greece, but due to battles fought with great heroism and cleverness by the Greeks, the Persians failed. Had the Greeks lost any of the close run against the Persians, the history of the world would have been changed radically, and I would argue for the better. It's so funny, when the movie 300 came out, all the rednecks in Louisiana, I was in the movie with them, in the movie theater with them, watching it, and they were all cheering, yeah, but I'm not gonna lie. I wanted the Persians to win. The Persians look badass. What was the king's name? I think his name was Xerxes or whatever. He looked badass. And imagine if we killed all the slave-owning Greeks. Imagine how different Western civilization would be if the premise wasn't how to get rich, not work, and own slaves, which is what Western civilization is built on. Continuing here. The Persian Wars also revealed the great political weakness of the polis system. The Greeks never fully united against the Persians, but set up short-term alliances that encouraged jockeying for supremacy. The main rivals were Sparta, the most potent land-based military power, and Athens, the largest and wealthiest of the polis. Athens' citizens numbered as many as 40,000, far more than any other polis, and its rich silver mines gave it enormous wealth. Because Athens had a port, the Piraeus, it became a great trading center, and it developed as a sea power against Sparta's formidable land power. As the Persian Wars continued, Athens became the most important Greek city, developing an empire controlling most of the Greek peninsula and reaching into Persian territories as the Persians retreated. Unsurprisingly, the Athenians fell victim to the Greek sin of hubris, excessive pride. They styled themselves the teachers of the Greeks, and other cities came to feel threatened by Athenian hegemony. Some polis allied with Athens' power, while others rallied around Athens' rival, Sparta, setting in motion a series of horrifically destructive civil wars known collectively as the Peloponnesian War. In the end, Sparta defeated Athens with the help of the Persians, but the devastation and loss of life and wealth were so great that no one could justly be called the victor. Greece was fatally weakened, set up for conquest by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, who in turn were replaced by the Romans. At its height, Athens was the cultural center of the Greek world, producing art, architecture, and philosophy whose influence lasted for millennia. It also became, for a while, a radical democracy, completely erasing status differences between the few aristocrats and the many common citizens. As the fortunes of war with Sparta ebbed and flowed, the aristocrats tried several times to seize power, only to be defeated by the partisans of democracy. The internal squabbling of Athenian citizens aided their enemies as disaffected aristocrats periodically defected to the Spartan or Persian cause. The tumults within Greece and within Athens are important to understanding the philosophy of Plato, who sought to find a world of unchanging truth behind the appearance of chaos. That was a little bit of history, very, very brief run through of the Peloponnesian Wars and Alexander the Great's origins, etc. Let's continue here. Teaching the polis, humanism, enter the sophists. Because it was a democracy, the key to success in the Athenian polis was rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Gaining political power depended on effective speech in the assembly, and being a litigious people, Athenian citizens had to argue lawsuits and sit in judgment on juries. Therefore, the ability to make and critically comprehend complex arguments was a skill of great value. Naturally, then, rhetoric became an object of study, a profession, and a body of expertise to be taught. The new teachers of rhetoric were called sophists, from sophistes, meaning expert. The source of our word, sophisticated. The art of rhetoric arrived in Athens from Syracuse in 427 BCE. The sophist Georgius came from Sicily to obtain Athenian aid for his city of Leontini against its enemy Syracuse. Although Georgius does not come off well in Plato's eponymous dialogue, the art of persuasion had come to stay. The sophists were the first paid professionals in history, and they represent the beginnings of higher as opposed to childhood education. The practical concerns of the sophists mark an important turn in philosophy, from concerns with physics to concern with human life and how it ought to be lived. As hired advocates and teachers of rhetoric, the sophists did not profess a general system of philosophy, but certain important philosophical attitudes emerged from their practice. If the sophists had a central idea, it was stated by Protagoras, who lived approximately 490 to 420 BCE, and he said, "Of all things, the measure of man is, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." Let's repeat that. Of all things, the measure man is, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. Protagoras' motto contains a range of meanings, from the personal through the cultural to the metaphysical. At the center of all of them, however, is humanism, a concern with human nature and human living. I just want to wrestle with that quote again. Of all things, the measure man is, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. I have to meditate on that more. On its narrowest, personal interpretation, man is the measure of all things, endorses a relativistic empiricism, a humanistic preference for appearance over reality. Whatever may be the ultimate constituent of nature, water, fire, or atoms, the world we humans live in is the world as it appears to us in our immediate experience. Truth for us, as a practical matter, will never be the physis, but will be the familiar world of people and things. Usable truth, therefore, lies in the appearance, not in a speculative reality. Yet, because truth is in appearances, truth is relative to each perceiver. Each human being is the only qualified judge of how things appear to him or her. Two people may enter the same room, yet to one the room is warm, to the other cool. And if it's to Acti, it's freezing. If the former, or the first person, has been out in a blizzard and the latter, or the last person, downstairs stoking the furnace, they will have different experiences. Neither perception is incorrect. Each is true for its perceiver, and there is no hidden reality of the matter. Man is the measure of all things, also carries a cultural, or to use a term of today, a multicultural meaning. The Greeks were cultural chauvinists. Their word barbarian, with all of its negative connotations, simply meant non-Greek speaking. For them, there is only one right way of life, the Greek way, and all others were ways of folly or wickedness. The sophists challenged Greek thinking on this point, championing a form of cultural relativism. Just as each person knows what is true for himself, so cultures may arrange their affairs in any number of equally valid and satisfying ways. Hellenes speak Greek, and Romans speak Latin. Neither is superior to the other. Greeks worship Zeus, the Anglo-Saxons, Wotan. Each is the god of his people. Finally, man is the measure of all things, has a metaphysical meaning. If the alleged reality of nature is unknowable, so too are the gods. There is no divine truth or God-given law to which human beings are subject. Right and wrong are matters for cultures, not gods, to decide. Science and philosophy ought not waste time on idle speculation about reality or the gods, but concern itself with practical achievements conducive to human happiness and work. The sophist relativism was an important innovation in the history of Western thought, but carried dangers for Greek democracy and for Western social and political thought down to the present. The sophists sharpened the division between physis, which means nature, and nomos, which means human law. By considering their way of life the best life, traditional Greeks identified physis, nature, and nomos, human law. The Greek way of life, their nomos, was the best. That is, the natural physis way of life, ideally suited to human nature. The sophists denied the identification, making nomos a matter of arbitrary convention, a set of equal ways of life lived in different cultures, none superior to another. Indeed, the sophist antiphon elevated convention, or nomos, above nature, saying that human laws bind human nature, presumably in different ways in different cultures. I guess the argument here is, what should we take into account when we're deciding what is the good life? Is it, nature, or is it the laws that we create? What is more important? Do we consider being in tune with nature or creating laws that promote or limit human nature? I guess that's the central theme of that debate between nomos versus physis. Continuing here. Psychological inquiry is important to the dispute between traditional Athenians and the sophists. The sophists assume that human nature is quite flexible, being happily adaptable to very different ways of life. Traditional Athenians saw human nature as relatively fixed, so that one culture, the free polis, was most suited to it, submerged for a time by the dominance of Christian thought, the nature of human nature and its implications for social policies became a prime problem for the Enlightenment. Psychology began to be politically important in the 18th century, when politicians rejected traditional forms of social organization, or nomos, in favor of forms rooted in a scientific understanding of human nature, physis. The tension between physis and nomos is as intense now as ever in the history of humankind. Is freedom the natural physis? Is freedom the natural yearning of the human heart, justifying the overthrow of despotic regimes, or should they be left alone as nomoi, different from, but no better or worse than our own? I guess what they're asking here is, is craving freedom a natural human condition, or is this a concept that is created? And if people live under a dictatorship or practice dictatorship to others, is this just as natural as our democratic, freedom-loving ways? Continuing, the immediate danger from sophistic humanism for Athenian democracy emerged in Plato's lifetime. The aristocrat Callicles says in Plato's dialogue, Gorgias, that laws are made by the weak and inferior, but more numerous citizens to fetter the naturally strong and superior aristocrats who ought naturally to rule over the weak masses. De Sade, Nietzsche, and in some moods, Freud, later agreed with Callicles' position. Callicles put his claim into action, participating in an aristocratic coup against Athenian democracy. Ever since the time of the sophists, the question of what human nature is and what, if any, way of life is natural to live have challenged those parts of psychology and philosophy devoted to human happiness. These challenges were first met head-on by Socrates. Before we jump to Socrates, we're going to read here. Oh, sorry, this is the Socrates box. Go into box 2.2, Socrates, the first modern. It seems silly to say that the first modern was a Greek who lived in the 4th century BCE, but it could be true. A big question about modernity, science, industrialization, urbanization, and spectacular economic growth was why it occurred in Western civilization and not in another of the world's great civilization, such as Islam or China. Okay, that's one of the whitest sentences I've ever read. Why did great things happen in the West and not in other places? Wait, what? Are you serious? That's one of the whitest things I've ever read. My God. Anyway, shit. Okay, as one book asked, why does the West rule? One feasible answer is the Greek miracle and Socrates' place at the heart of that miracle. Socrates went around asking people why they did what they did. Most people in societies are content to just keep doing what they have been doing as long as things work out okay. But Socrates stepped back and asked people to think about and to justify their beliefs and actions. This can bring trouble. It brought Socrates' death, but it provokes change. Only if one thinks about why one is doing things can one then think about doing things differently and doing things better. One can move past results that are okay to trying for better outcomes, for economic innovation and growth, not the static outcomes of the Malthusian economy. The restlessness of modernism seeking for constant change and improvement began with the restless moral questioning of Socrates. So basically, they're tying modernism to the idea of constant change, progress, challenging the norms, and I would argue that several civilizations, from what we know, had their own thinkers that challenged the norms, created new norms, debated, and dealt with ideas. It's very Western centric, European centric, Eurocentric, white, I would say, to just be like, why did the West come up with all these great things? Like philosophy. It wasn't like, the Greeks didn't literally travel to Egypt to learn mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and all those types of things. Oh my God. It wasn't like China had thousands and thousands of years of philosophy, or like civilizations in India. The oldest religion on the planet is Hinduism. Literally, the oldest religion on the planet, still practiced today by millions, if not a billion people at least, is Hinduism, which contains its own cosmology, philosophy, psychology, etc. But why did the West come up with these things? That's so insane. Anyway, I'm sorry. Continuing. Enlightenment and eudaimonia, Socrates. Much to his own liking, Socrates was a troublesome and troubling figure in his own lifetime and has remained so in the history of Western thought. Esteemed the greatest of philosophers, for conventional Athenians, Socrates was a troublemaker whose deliberately provocative questions about virtue corrupted their children and undermined their morals. For Christian philosophers, and especially for people still Christian in outlook if not in faith, Socrates became an attractive figure, a poor, wandering seeker after virtue who annoyed the smug and the self-righteous, and whose reward was execution. Although a citizen of Athens and an admired soldier, Socrates, like Jesus, came from a modest background, being the son of a stonemason, and challenged the reigning values of the day, whether the aristocrat's love of power and glory or the merchant's love of money. Speaking to the jury that condemned him, Socrates said, I go about doing nothing but persuading you, young and old, to care not for the body or money in place of it, or so much as excellence of soul. For the old aristocratic class of Athens, and later for Friedrich Nietzsche and the German neo-pagans of the turn of the century, some of whom turned to that decisive leader Hitler, Socrates and Jesus were evil teachers who clouded the minds of the naturally strong with altruistic morality and bound their hands with manacles of law passed by the weak. Socrates, it seems, was a dangerous man, but what did he teach? In a sense, nothing. Socrates was a moral philosopher unconcerned with physics, and, though Athenians took him for one, he was not a sophist teaching expertise for a fee. He was on a self-defined quest for the nature of true virtue and goodness, though he professed not to know what they were. In his teaching, he would closely question a young man or group of young men about some topic related to virtue. What is justice, beauty, courage, the good? Socrates' interlocutors would offer conventional definitions that Socrates dismantled with clever and penetrating questions. For example, in the Gorgias, Callicles defines justice as the rule of the strong, reflecting his aristocratic birth and sophistic training. So devastating is Socrates' assault on Callicles' beliefs, however, that Callicles flees rather than give them up. So damn, Socrates had the rich and powerful running just from debating with them. Okay, he was the first debate bro. Those who stayed with Socrates came to share his own mental state of aporia, or enlightened ignorance. With Socrates, they had to confess they were ignorant about what justice or whatever virtue was under discussion really was, but realized they were better off than before because they had been disabused of their conventional but wrong beliefs. Socrates feared that in their acquisition of an empire and the hubris that it had engendered, Athenians had strayed from the path of Sophrosyne, and his mission was to deflate imperial arrogance and restore traditional Greek self-control. Although Socrates taught no positive doctrine, his philosophical and psychological approaches contained several important innovations. The philosophical innovation was his search for the general nature of the virtues and of virtue itself. We intuitively recognize that repaying a loan and establishing a democracy are just acts, but what they have in common, what justice itself as such is, remains elusive. A spectacular sunset and a Mozart symphony are both beautiful, but what they share in common, what beauty itself is, remains likewise elusive. Moreover, Socrates took his inquiries to a higher level. Justice, beauty, honor, and so on are all good, but what have they in common? Or what good itself is remains, Moreover, Socrates took his inquiries to a higher level. Justice, beauty, honor, and so on are all good, but what they have in common, or of moral philosophy, Socrates began to try to understand the meaning and nature of abstract human concepts such as justice and beauty. Plato and Aristotle would broaden Socrates' quest from ethics to include the whole range of human concepts in every area, creating the field of epistemology, the search for truth itself, a central undertaking of later philosophy and cognitive psychology. Socrates' method, a special sort of dialogue called the elenchus, was innovative as well. Socrates believed that everyone possesses moral truth, even if they are unaware of it. Socrates called himself a midwife to knowledge of virtue, bringing it out of people by questions rather than simply teaching it to them. So, for example, he would use specific cases to undermine false ideas about virtue. A young man might define courage in Bronze Age fashion as fighting honorably and fearlessly against one's enemies, and Socrates might counter it with something like the charge of the Light Brigade, brave but foolish, and bringing death and defeat to one's family, followers, and fellow citizens. Such questions and problems weakened and eventually, for those who stayed, dislodged false beliefs and ended in aporia, uncertainty about the real nature of virtue. In some respects, the Socratic elenchus is the starting point of various forms of psychotherapy. With Socrates, psychotherapists maintain that we have learned false beliefs that make us ill, yet we possess hidden and liberating truths that can be found through dialogue with a personal guide. Honestly, I know I'm highly critical of Western thought and Western civilization, but I can also give it up that I'm an admirer of Socrates, and that description of being a midwife to the knowledge of virtue that's inside of the self, to me, that's incredibly beautiful. That's an incredibly beautiful way of thinking about the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of any sort of human science or any sort of endeavor to gain knowledge or truth, right? The idea is that within us as people, all people who are able to think clearly and aren't hindered by anything that could stop us from thinking logically, right? Within us all, we do have a divine truth or the ability to access truth, but a lot of us are scared of it. We run away from it. We're scared to express our true ideas or beliefs because we're afraid of being laughed at or mocked or challenged by those ideas by other people. And yet, what Socrates was saying, like, don't be afraid, hold my hand, come with me, and let's find the truth together. That's so beautiful to me. You know what I mean? That's a great way to describe what I think. People who are interested in philosophy or finding reasons and motivations to make the world better. That's what we should be doing. Be a midwife, just like Socrates, a midwife to knowledge of virtue. bringing it out of people by questions rather than simply teaching it to them. I find that extremely beautiful. I'm sorry. Because I just imagined, like, your mind is open and Socrates has his hand in your mind and he's slowly pulling out like your soul baby. You know what I mean? That's how I just visualized it. I'm going to continue here. Okay? So don't think I'm just hella critical of Western civilization and I just say white man bad. I don't just say white man bad. I also say, hey, the white man came up with some good ideas. I'm not going to lie. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. So Socrates also believed that nothing deserves the name knowledge or truth unless we are conscious of it and can explain it. A person might infallibly do the right things, but for Socrates, he or she was not truly virtuous without being able to explicitly and rationally justify his or her actions. In his quest for virtue, Socrates demanded more than good behavior or correct intuitions about right and wrong. He demanded a theory of virtue. The Greek word theoria means contemplation. In the Symposium, the semi-divine Cyrus, an alleged teacher of Socrates, Diotima says to him, "Don't you know that right opinion without ability to render an account is not knowledge? How could an accountable thing be knowledge? Right opinion is intermediate between wisdom and ignorance." Interesting. So I didn't know that Socrates' teacher was a woman. And I love how that's just kept out of every Western philosophy class. I love how that's kept out of, because I literally am today years old when I found out Socrates' teacher was a woman. And don't you think the way we interact with Western science or Western studies of any type would be totally different if we were actually taught about the people who are pushed to the margins, like Diotima, the woman who taught Socrates? I find that fascinating too. Number one, I am not a psychologist, but I find this book very good in reading for just understanding a different type of worldview and also challenging my own. You know what I mean? But continuing, Socrates' requirement that knowledge can be explicitly stated and defended theory was adopted by Plato and became a standard goal of Western philosophy, setting it off from two other forms of human thought. The first are dogmatic religions that do not allow natural reason to question divine revelation. Islam, after the 13th century, failed to develop natural philosophy and science on just this ground. Okay, that's just, oh God. As soon as I start liking the book, he just have to throw in white man racism. He just have to throw in some Islamophobia. Islam never developed philosophy and science just this ground, on just this ground. Are you so frustrating. Literally, the Arabs were the ones who were translating Aristotle and Socrates and all the other ancient Greek thinkers, because the Europeans, after the fall of Rome, essentially burnt all their books and just started believing in the Bible and only let the priests read to them in Latin, the language they didn't even learn. So the Arabs had to come and translate all that Latin because they were the ones that brought paper to Europe and were the first ones publishing books, creating printing houses and shit like that. And there was a whole branch of Islam. There was a sort of Islamic enlightenment, and I believe the group or the sect was called the Mu'tazil. The Mu'tazil were Muslims who basically wanted to encompass ancient Greek philosophy and cosmology and things like that into Islam, right? But they were beaten out by a more secular form, orthodox form of Islam, and that's where we are today. But the Islamic Golden Age happened when all the, basically the high point of Islamic civilization was all built upon a type of philosophy and science. Are you serious? I'm sorry this one sentence set me off, but reading something like that makes me scared that in this book, later, Africa is going to get a lot of shade. Africa is going to get a lot of shade. This was a book recommended to me by my teacher. You put this up on the teams, and this guy sentences like this. Islam, after the 13th century, failed to develop natural philosophy and science on just this ground. In a somewhat similar way, China, too, failed to develop science because of the total control of thought exercised by its divinely appointed emperors and their bureaucrats, the Confucian mandarins. This is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. This is like the worst Reddit post ever. This is like 4chan level. Anyway, the other traditions are those that value intuition rather than logic, such as Buddhism or Western Romanticism. Within psychology today, there is a movement called embodied cognition that deprecates the explicit and verbal side of knowledge and elevates intuitive knowledge of the world we use to practically interact with it. Finally, in his concern with virtue, Socrates raised important psychological questions about human motivation. Central problems for any moral philosophy are providing reasons why people should do right and explaining why they so often do wrong. The first problem, why people should be virtuous, was never a difficulty for Greek and Roman philosophers because they assumed, entirely without discussion, that virtue and eudaimonia were deeply linked, if not identical. The usual translation of eudaimonia into English is happiness, but eudaimonia meant more than the attainment of pleasure, though it included pleasure. It meant living well or flourishing. Like all Greeks, Socrates assumed that the proper end of life was eudaimonia, and he believed that virtuous living would bring eudaimonia. Thus, he, in common with Greeks, generally assumed that all people Thus he, in common with Greeks generally, assumed that because all people seek happiness, eudaimonia, they naturally seek virtue, and there was therefore no need to provide special reasons for doing good. Plato asserts in the Symposium 205, translated, okay, all right, yeah. Plato asserts in the Symposium, the happy are happy by possession of good things, and there is no need, in addition, to ask further for what purpose he who wishes to be happy wishes it. On the contrary, the answer seems final. In their causal linking of virtue and happiness, the Greeks differed sharply from later ethical systems, including Christianity, which urge us to be ethical but warn that pursuing virtue often brings suffering rather than happiness. Classical Greeks also differed from the Stoics and Christians in restricting moral concern to an individual's happiness and perhaps the happiness of his polis. Concern with other human beings simply because they were human beings formed no part of the classical concept of virtue. Because Greek and Roman ethical philosophers had no problem explaining why people should behave well, they focused instead on the question of why people don't always do so. If virtue and happiness are almost the same, the existence of bad behavior, behavior that makes a person unhappy, becomes hard to explain. Because people want to be happy, they therefore ought always to act rightly. Socrates proposed a purely intellectual answer to the problem of bad behavior, maintaining that people act wrongly only when they are ignorant of the good. A thirsty person would not knowingly drink poison, but might do so on the false belief that it was pure water. Harmful acts are never chosen as such, but only when the actor is ignorant of their bad consequences. Socrates' explanation of bad behavior was predicated on the assumption behind the alunchus that people intuitively know what virtue is, but that false beliefs acquired from their upbringing mask this knowledge and may lead them to do wrong. Once someone knows what virtue truly is, he will automatically act correctly. Thus, Callicles, having abandoned his dialogue with Socrates, participated in the aristocratic coup because he remained in the grip of the false belief that justice was the rule of the strong. In Socrates' account, Callicles was not evil but simply misguided. Had he continued his encounter with Socrates, he would have learned that justice was not the rule of the strong and would not have sought the overthrow of democracy. For Socrates, knowledge of the good, not a goodwill of virtuous character, was all that was needed to affect good behavior. Later Greek and Roman ethical philosophers, including Plato himself and the early Christians, found Socrates' intellectual solution implausible because, manifestly, Some people enjoy wrongdoing, and even virtuous people sometimes knowingly do wrong because their wills are too weak to overcome temptation, a mental condition the Greeks called akrasia. Wrestling with the sources of evil in human behavior became an important question for motivational psychology. Moving forward, so we're going to go to the great classical philosophies. Plato, The Quest for Perfect Knowledge. Unlike his teacher, the son of a stonemason, Plato sprang from the old aristocratic class that was losing power as the Athenian polis became more democratic. When Sparta finally defeated Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, a clique of aristocrats, including two of Plato's relatives, carried out the short-lived coup against the Athenian democracy in which Callicles participated. Ironically, when the coup was defeated, Socrates was caught up in the purge of aristocrats and their supporters because so many of them, like Callicles, had been in his circle of students. Socrates was condemned to the death he chose in preference to exile from the city he loved. As a result, Plato became disenchanted with politics as he knew it. Aristocrats, even relatives, friends, and students, might selfishly sacrifice the general good to personal ambition. A democracy might fear and kill a loyal yet critical citizen because he questioned conventional ideas of virtue. So it says here, Sparta defeated Athens, and, there's a bunch of aristocrats. Two of Plato's relatives were a part of the coup against the Athenian democracy, and this caused Plato to become, disenchanted with politics because Socrates was killed, because of his questioning and things like that. Socrates, the first moral philosopher, had tried to find an overarching idea of the good. His student, Plato, built on and broadened Socrates' moral concerns. Filling Socrates' aporia with his own philosophy, Plato dedicated his philosophy above all to the pursuit of justice both in the state and in the individual. The Greek word for justice, dikaiosun, I cannot pronounce that, but how did that word become justice? Dikaiosun had a specific meaning, getting out of life what one fairly deserved, no more and no less, reflecting the Greek goal of homonoia. Fish eaters and the aristocratic junta were guilty of justice's corresponding vice, pleonexia, a grasping for more than one is fairly due. Plato tried to lead his students from their conventional Greek understanding of justice to a new one, doing good for its own sake and not for the parochial sake of the health of their own polis. Plato's new understanding of virtue would later make its way into Christianity. Cognition. What is knowledge? Socrates had tried to find a general definition of virtue. Plato saw that Socrates' quest was part of a larger undertaking, that of finding definitions for any sort of general terms. Just as we can define courage apart from particular courageous actions, or beauty apart from particular beautiful things or people, so we can define cat apart from any particular cats, or fish apart from any particular fish. Talk of cats and fish may seem to make Plato's quest trivial, but it is not. According to the Greeks, what sets human beings apart from animals is the capacity for abstract knowledge, while animals respond only to the concrete here and now. Science, including psychology, searches for general knowledge about how things are everywhere in the universe at any point in time. Psychologists run experiments on small groups of people, but build theories about human nature. In a social psychology experiment, for example, our concern is not why Bob Smith or Susan Jones failed to help a person in distress, but why people so often fail to help others in similar situations. Plato was the first thinker to inquire into how knowledge is possible and how it may be justified. In philosophy, he created the field of epistemology, the study of knowledge that eventually gave rise to cognitive psychology. Modern science, heir to the empiricist tradition in epistemology that Empedocles inaugurated, justifies its claims to knowledge by citing observations. However, science has learned to live with an ugly fact about generalizations based on past experience. As Plato was the first to point out, what seems true based on today's data may be overturned by tomorrow's. The truth for which Socrates died could not be so transient, so tentative, Plato thought. Truth had to be permanent and knowable with certainty. Continuing here, wrestling with skepticism. For the Platonists, then, truth, and hence our knowledge of it, has two defining characteristics. First, a belief is true, is knowledge, if and only if it is true in all times and all places absolutely. Socrates wanted to know what justice or beauty is, apart from just acts and beautiful things, and knowledge of justice or beauty itself would therefore be true of all just acts and beautiful things in the past, now, and forever. Second, for Plato, as for Socrates, knowledge had to be rationally justifiable. A judge who always judges rightly, or a connoisseur of impeccable taste, does not, for Plato, genuinely know the truth unless he can explain his judgments and by force of argument convince others they are correct. Unlike the later skeptics who are also students of Socrates, Plato never questioned Socrates' faith that there was a truth to replace aporia, and he accepted earlier philosophers' arguments that sense perception was not the path to knowledge. From Heraclitus, Plato took the belief that the phusis was fire, and thus the conclusion that the physical world was always in a state of becoming. Because the truth Plato sought lay in the realm of being, eternally and unchangeably true, knowledge of it could not derive from material senses reflecting the changing material world. From the sophists, Plato took the belief that how the world seems to each person in each culture is relative to each of them. Observation, therefore, is tainted by individual differences and the sort of cultural preconceptions that Socrates had challenged. For Plato, then, even if the copy of theory of cognition was an accurate account of human perception, it was not adequate as a theory for finding eternal truth. Plato rejected psychology for an idealistic metaphysics. Okay. Mathematics and the theory of the forms. So far, Plato had not gotten past Socratic aporia. Plato was convinced that transcendental truth exists, and that perception was not the path to knowledge. Then, in midlife, Plato studied geometry with the Pythagoreans and was transformed by it, as Thomas Hobbes and Clark Hull would be centuries later. In mathematics, Plato found not only a path to truth, but also something of the nature of truth itself. Plato came to side with Parmenides in holding that the way of truth was the inward path of logical reasoning about ideas rather than the outward path of seeming about physical objects. But he went beyond them to describe what truth, a picture of reality beyond observation, was. In the Phaedo, Plato has Socrates conclude, so when does the soul grasp truth? For whenever she undertakes to investigate anything with the body, it is clear that she will be thoroughly deceived by the body. Therefore, it is reasoning, if anywhere, that any reality becomes clearly revealed to the soul. Most of us have, in high school or college, done proofs in geometry, such as the Pythagorean theorem, that the area of a square erected on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the areas of squares erected on the other two sides. For Plato, the first revelation of geometry was the notion of proof. The Pythagorean theorem was provable and therefore true, a piece of genuine knowledge supported by logical argument rather than observation and measurement. The Socratic requirement that knowledge be justified by reason was satisfied by geometry because anyone who followed the steps of the proof is compelled to believe the theorem. Geometry supported rationalism's claim that the logic was the way of truth. Plato went on to assert that reason was the way to reality and the realm of being too. The Pythagorean theorem is true not merely of a triangle drawn by someone doing the proof, or of all the people who have ever done or will do the proof, but of every right-angled triangle. However, given that the Pythagorean theorem is true, and that it is not true simply of triangles drawn by mathematicians, or a mere statistical generalization from a sample of triangles, but is a real universal truth, of what object is it true? Plato asserted that it was true of what he called the form of the right-angled triangle, an eternally existing perfect right-angled triangle of no particular size. The idea of form helped reconcile being and becoming and provided a solution for Socrates' questions about virtue that had implications beyond ethical philosophy. Forms belong to the realm of being, subsisting eternally, while their material but ephemeral copies belong to the realm of becoming. Similarly, in Socrates' ethical realm, every courageous act resembles the form of courage, every beautiful object resembles the form of beauty, and every just act resembles the form of justice. Courage, beauty, and justice, each of them being good, resemble the form of the good. Genuine knowledge, then, which Socrates had sought in the moral domain, was knowledge of the forms of things, not of physical things or events. It is important to grasp an aspect of Plato's thinking that is alien to us. We tend to believe that thinking a sculpture or a person is beautiful is a matter of subjective aesthetic judgment, shaped by what our society or our friends and family tell us is beautiful. Other people in other cultures might have different opinions, and like the sophists, we accept these as individual differences rooted in culture or individual taste. From Socrates, Plato accepted that societies might instill different views of beauty and ugliness, but unlike the sophists, he did not conclude that judgment of beauty were therefore matters of local taste. For Plato, a person or sculpture was beautiful by resembling the form of beauty. A sculpture or person was ugly by departing from the form of beauty. Similarly, an act was good because it participated in the form of the good. Beauty and virtue were not subjective judgments of people and cultures, but real properties that objects actually possessed, like size or weight. If two people or cultures disagreed about whether a person was beautiful or an act virtuous, at least one of them was wrong because he or she was ignorant of the form of beauty or the good. Socrates' goal was to find out what virtue was and teach it to people, regardless of social opinion, so they could act upon their knowledge. Plato elaborated Socrates' idea into metaphysical realism. The form really exists as non-physical objects. Indeed, for Plato, the forms were more real than their observable copies, because they were eternal, existing outside the physical realm of becoming. So essentially, everything sort of has like a soul, a material soul. This bottle here is beautifully designed because it is close to the form of beauty, right? A bottle could be designed ugly, or there could be an ugly designed bottle because it is far away from the form of beauty, is how, Plato is putting it, right? And I guess my question to Plato would have been, do people have to learn about the form, or is it inherent? So when people are judging things as beautiful in their culture or their society, or subjectively within our own culture or society, is it innate that they know what the form of beauty or good is? Or is this something that they have to be taught to recognize, to then value and assess if something is beautiful? Because I have to, I guess, this goes even deeper now, because the form of this bottle and it being beautiful is mostly based on, how closely it resembles a woman, to me, at least, right? Maybe that's a subconscious way, but I also think it's beautiful because, it's clear, right? But that might be my subjective view. I like clear water, right? And this is what makes this bottle beautiful. And also, I guess, it's beautiful because it functions so effortlessly. It has like this little grip here that I can hold on, easy to hold. Though I think the European tendency to have the caps connected at the top by plastic holders is far from the beauty. It's far from the form. Anyway, the Greek word Plato used to talk about the form was idea. I guess that's idea. I will say idea. The Greek word Plato used to talk about the forms was idea. The history of later usages of this word is significant both in psychology and philosophy. You can see that the word is the same as the modern English word idea, a psychological entity. Descartes and Locke introduced this use of the term in the 17th century, giving rise to the representational theory of mind found in modern cognitive psychology. But it is not what Plato meant, hence the translation of idea as form. For Plato, forms were emphatically not just private thoughts, but existed outside human minds as fixed, universal objects of thought. He would have been horrified at the subjectivity implied by idea, the subjective, transient conception of truth he wanted to destroy, that of the two people in the winter room with their private ideas about its temperature. Nevertheless, in philosophy, the term idealism still is used to characterize later descendants of Plato's, such as Kant, who regarded the world of idea outside any human's personal experience as the realm of the true and beautiful. All right, I think we have time to read one more section. We're going to read one more section, and then we're going to call it a day right here. So, imagining the forms. As Plato realized, describing the forms is difficult, if not impossible, because by their very nature they cannot be displayed. Instead, Plato offered metaphors for the forms, descriptions of the child of goodness, rather than goodness itself. 3 of these similes, the sun, the lion, and the cave, are given in the Republic. A 4th, which offers a psychological path to the forms, the ladder of love, occurs in the Symposium, probably written just before the Republic. The simile of the sun, illumination by the good. In the simile of the sun, Plato says that the form of the good is to the intelligible world of the forms what the sun is to the physical world of objects, the copies of the forms. Let's repeat that because I think that's highly important. In the simile of the sun, Plato says that the form of the good is to the intelligible world of the forms what the sun is to the physical world of the objects, the copies of the forms. Plato did not think of vision as happening because light entered the eye as we do today. That conception was developed centuries later. Instead, the eye was thought to have a power of seeing by sending out rays that struck physical objects. Nevertheless, because it's hard to see at night, everyone recognized that light had to be present in order for vision to occur. The light of the sun was the other third thing needed in addition to the eye and an object for vision to occur. In the intelligible realm, reason has the power to grasp the forms, as in the physical world, the eye has the power to see. However, in the intelligible realm, an other third thing is needed to illuminate the forms, making it possible for reason to know them. By themselves, the senses lack the power to perceive the world accurately, but need the help of divine illumination. Plato says that the third thing, the source of divine illumination, is the form of the good, analogous to the light of the sun on earth. Very interesting. This is deep. This is deep as hell. This is very fascinating. The metaphor of the line, the hierarchy of opinion and knowledge. The simile of the sun is followed by the appropriately geometrical metaphor of the line. Imagine a line divided into 4 unequal sections, each of whose relative length is a measure of its degree of truth. The line is first divided into 2 large sections. The lower and shorter section stands for the world of appearances and opinions, beliefs without proof, based on perception. The higher and longer section stands for the world of the forms and provable knowledge about them. The world of appearances line is further divided into segments for the worlds of imagining, the shortest line segment of all, and of belief, the next shortest in length. Apprehension of images is the most imperfect way of knowing. Imagining is the lowest level of cognition, dealing with mere images of concrete objects, such as images cast in water. Plato relegated representational art to this realm. For when we see a portrait of a man, we are seeing only an image, an imperfect copy of a thing. Plato banished representational art from his utopian republic, and his hostility to images entered some later religions. In 2002, the world looked on with horror as the Taliban of Afghanistan destroyed large statues of Buddha because they represented a physical human form, a destructive tradition carried on today by ISIS at Nineveh and Palmyra. Better than looking at images is looking at objects themselves. Plato called this belief. With the next longer section of the line, thinking, we move from mere opinion to real knowledge, beginning with mathematical knowledge. Proofs vouchsafe the truth of mathematical propositions, and the objects of mathematical knowledge are not observable things, but forms themselves. Mathematics, however, while providing a model of knowledge, was recognized by Plato to be imperfect and incomplete. It is imperfect because mathematical proofs rest upon assumptions that cannot themselves be proven, falling short of the Socratic ideal of justified knowledge. For example, geometric proofs, the form of mathematics most developed in Plato's time, depend on improving positing of axioms that may be intuitively appealing, such as the axiom that parallel lines never meet. Plato sensed what later turned out to be correct, that if one changes the axioms, different systems of geometry emerge. To be true, in Plato's sense, then, geometry needed metaphysical support, which he provided with the forms. Mathematics is incomplete because not all knowledge concerns mathematics. Highest in the importance were the moral truths sought by Socrates. The highest and longest segment of the line then represents the world of the forms, the place of all truths, mathematical or otherwise. Greatest among the forms is naturally the form of the good, the ultimate object of Socrates and Plato's quest. Okay, so I think we're going to stop here with Plato because he's going way too deep. Plato is going way too deep, but I find the forms absolutely fascinating. And I'm stopping right here because I believe that we're all familiar with the allegory of the cave. I think Plato surpassed Socrates in just philosophing, if that makes sense. Like he philosophied the fuck out of philosophy, if that makes sense. Plato was going nuts. He was going ham. He was in the kitchen whipping up the babies. You feel me? He was going insane with this shit. Because this is dope. This is some ill shit. I'm not going to lie. But let's look at the last part, figure 2-2, Plato's metaphor of the line. And so we have this graph here that shows the intelligible world on one side and the world of appearances on the other side. We have objects in the intelligible world. They are the good, forms, and mathematical objects. And in the world of appearances, the objects are visible things and images. And we have states of mind. We have intelligence or knowledge. And then we also have thinking as well. And in the world of appearances, we have belief and imagining. So this is Plato's metaphor of the line drawn out. He was going crazy. Plato was going crazy. Plato is the GOAT. Plato is my GOAT, my God. He was going insane. Jesus. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up here. Hopefully you enjoyed today's live stream. It was very educational for me, very enlightening for me, very moving for me. I really enjoyed this episode. This is episode 5 of A History of Psychology. Looking forward to doing more of these. Hope y'all are easy out there, and peace.